This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 693 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. FanDuel and GMC are back to bring you the GMC Sierra Mountain Climber Pick'em, a free-to-play contest series that gives you a chance to win a share of $10,000 in FanDuel site credit every Sunday, courtesy of GMC. Here's how it works. Every Sunday during the NFL season, you'll have a chance to answer questions based on the day's 1 p.m. and 4:25 p.m. games. The more questions you answer correctly, the higher up the mountain you'll move. If during any week you answer every question correctly for a perfect score, you'll reach the summit and win your share of $10,000 in site credit. The contest series is now live, so head to fanduel.com/free/contest/GMC to start climbing the mountain. Let's get to these 15 transactions. Sell Brian Robinson. Look, Brian Robinson has now played 2 games since getting shot in an attempted robbery. Given those circumstances, having high expectations wouldn't make that much sense. Robinson just being on the field is pretty freaking amazing. I think everyone's rooting for Robinson here. We've just got to analyze this from a fantasy football perspective. We're trying to win fantasy championships. During these 2 games with Robinson, he's handled roughly 73% of Washington's running back rushes. He's coming off a top 20 performance against the Bears in Week 6. That's not a bad thing, but there are some bad things. He's yet to see a target, and even though he had 17 carries against Chicago this past week, he still played fewer than 50% of the Commanders' snaps. And maybe Robinson will only get better. After all, he was shot, and then he's played only 2 games. I don't think that that's an unreasonable take. The problem is we now have a pretty large sample of Washington using J.D. McKissic as a pass-catching back. Antonio Gibson dealt with that last year, and he even dealt with it a little bit this year. Antonio Gibson's numbers with J.D. McKissic were a lot worse than without J.D. McKissic last year. And Gibson himself is a problem. Again, what Robinson is doing here is unbelievable. I honestly feel a little bit weird saying anything negative about Brian Robinson. But I have to be honest, when watching that game, Antonio Gibson looked a lot more explosive. And he's been better in expected points added per rush over the team's last 2 games. Even last week after that Bears game, Ron Rivera said, quote, "We got a little bit away from Antonio, and that's something I'm going to put on us coaches." They're going to use Antonio Gibson a little bit more than they did last week, more than likely. At least sounds that way. And Robinson's most likely not going to be used that much as a receiver. So he's splitting some early down work, and he's not seeing that much receiving work. This is a combination that we don't want in fantasy football. It's why we were fading Antonio Gibson to start the season. The difference between Robinson and Gibson was cost to acquire. It was a lot easier to draft Brian Robinson late than Antonio Gibson in the middle rounds. But now you might be able to capitalize on Brian Robinson. That's why he's a sell candidate. Add Kyren Williams. So there's a lot of Cam Akers drama going on in LA right now. Jay Glazer believes that Akers has played his final snap with the Rams, and if that's the case, that opens up this backfield. Because Akers was averaging a 72% running back rush share per game over his last 4 before this past week. Now, Darrell Henderson's the next logical man up, and he got his chance in Week 6. The problem, he wasn't exactly a bell cow back. He had okay usage, but he wasn't this true workhorse bell cow. He scored 13.2 PPR points, that was thanks to a touchdown, but he handled just 60% of the team's running back rushes, and he was just shy of a 10% target share. Again, those numbers aren't bad, but it would have been nice to see him with his Week 1 usage instead. In Week 1, he had an 80% running back rush share and a 12% target share. I mean, look at his competition. In Week 6, Henderson was losing snaps to Malcolm Brown and Ronnie Rivers. Brown was signed just a couple of weeks ago, and Rivers is a smaller back who lacks speed. It's just not a good sign when you can't see workhorse numbers with that type of competition. Now, the Rams' poor offensive line play, it's well documented. I've talked about it a lot on this show. Everyone's talking about it. But then on top of that, according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed metric, LA running backs have a bottom 5 schedule from here on out. So where am I going with this? Well, number one, that's one of the reasons why you may consider selling Darrell Henderson after this week. I don't think a lot of people are lining up to buy him, so it's probably more of a hold situation, but the situation surrounding Henderson himself it's not butterflies and rainbows. And because Henderson isn't some proven back who can absolutely handle this massive workload week in and week out, you might want to look at Kyren Williams. Prior to week 1, ESPN's Adam Schefter, he talked about how Williams could be in store for a larger than expected role in that Rams offense. The problem was Kyren Williams got hurt really early in that game. We didn't get to see him, and that ankle injury has sidelined him ever since. But he's supposed to be back soon, and this backfield is a mess. So there's a possibility that Kyren Williams does get some more run. He's someone that my prospect model didn't love a ton because he had a really bad speed score. He failed to hit the threshold that the model wants running backs to hit, but his production profile was really good. I liked Kyren Williams a lot before athletic testing. He can play a pass-catching role. But yeah, overall, the Rams don't have a super desirable situation for a running back. Not only is the offensive line bad, but their schedule's not that good either. But the cost to acquire Kyren Williams is not very high. You can add him off the waiver wire. That's different than Darrell Henderson. Buy Rashad Bateman. I know that you just heard that transaction and you're like, what? Why would I be trading for Rashad Bateman right now? Yeah, it's a risky transaction. He's hurt. He's got a foot injury that sidelined him in week 6. And according to Edwin Porras of Fantasy Points, he's likely to return in the week 8 timeframe. And we don't even know if he's going to be effective when he comes back. So there is risk to this transaction. But here's the thing. Bateman managers probably pretty frustrated. He was fine in weeks 1 and 2 because of a pair of touchdowns, but weeks 3 and 4 saw him combine to score just a little over 10 PPR points. Since then, he hasn't played. But the thing is, from now through the end of the season, Baltimore has the best schedule for wide receivers when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. They only have one below average matchup for wideouts through week 17. And thus far, Baltimore wide receivers have faced the 6th toughest schedule. So my recommendation here, don't give up a true starter for Rashad Bateman. Throw some bench assets at him. He's a very good young player. And I think that if he's healthy, he should be able to produce in this offense. And that's especially true given the matchups that he's going to face. Hold Garrett Wilson and drop Elijah Moore. The Jets are a perfect example of how game script can influence fantasy football. With Joe Flacco under center weeks 1 through 3, New York ran 106 plays while trailing by 10 or more points. Since then, over their next 3, that total is just 11. They've run 11 plays while trailing by 10 or more points. Of course, the Jets are going to be more pass heavy when they're trailing by so many points. In weeks 1 through 3, their pass rate was a little over 73%. Over their last 3, it's 44%. Because the Jets are winning. Yeah, they're a little bit more run heavy in neutral environments. But they're winning. That's why there's such a massive, massive gap. They're not necessarily winning because of Zach Wilson, but he's been the quarterback when they've been winning. So in turn, his passing volume has been lower compared to where Joe Flacco was at. This creates associations in the minds of fantasy managers. Garrett Wilson was awesome with Joe Flacco, but he sucks with Zach Wilson. Now that's not wrong, but it's not necessarily because of Wilson. With Flacco, Garrett Wilson's target share per game rate was 22.5%. With Zach Wilson, it's 22.2%. It's just that the Jets passed more when Flacco was under center. Game script forced them to. And that resulted in 10.7 targets per game for Garrett Wilson. Over his last 3, that number is just 5, with almost an identical target share. But Wilson's a talented player who's seeing a good target share in his offense. That's not someone that you want to drop in fantasy football. Should you bench him? Sure. But it's bye week season. Players like Wilson can still be fill-ins. But with Elijah Moore, it's a different story. A lot of you listening to this know that I love me some Elijah Moore. I think he's a very, very good player. I was into him this offseason. I thought that he was a good pick. So right now, listening to this, you can toss me a giant L. I'm taking the L. I was wrong about Elijah Moore. Corey Davis played more snaps than Moore this past Sunday, and Moore failed to see a target. He's now hit a 20% target share in just one game this year. He hasn't even gotten to double-digit PPR points yet in a single contest. And the Jets have the hardest schedule for wide receivers and adjusted fantasy points allowed from now through the end of the fantasy season. They're also playing well. Like I said, game script has been in their favor more. So while Garrett Wilson's a hold given his workload in this offense, I think Moore in most leagues can unfortunately be dropped. Add Wan'Dale Robinson. Another player I like this year is Wan'Dale Robinson, and we finally got to see him on the field again. And he didn't disappoint. He captured a 16% target share while scoring a touchdown. What made that target share so impressive was that according to Next Gen Stats, Robinson ran the 4th most routes at wide receiver for the Giants. He had 4 targets on just 11 routes run, so he was targeted at a very, very high rate. Imagine a world where he's not coming back from injury, and the Giants use him as a primary wide receiver. I think even better days are ahead for Wan'Dale Robinson. Add Robert Tonyan. Robert Tonyan's still available in more than half of Yahoo leagues. He's trending way up. Entering week 6, he had compiled just 1 game with a 20% target share. Against the Jets on Sunday, he had a 27% target share, and he saw his best route participation of the season. Remember, guys, Robert Tonyan was coming off an ACL injury from last season. It makes sense that he wouldn't be 100% to kick off this season. And with the tight end position being such a mess, I think he's a great add. Buy David Montgomery. Khalil Herbert made an awesome play on Thursday night against the Commanders, but David Montgomery is still the dude in the backfield. When Montgomery returned from injury 2 weeks ago, he walked right back into his old workload. I talked about this on the 10 Trends episode. He handled 75% of the team's running back rushes, and he had a 19% target share. This past week, those numbers fell to 68%, so 7 percentage points lower in running back rush share, and 4%, so significantly lower in target share. The good news, though, is that his broader peripherals did not take a hit. He still was on the field for 78% of Chicago's snaps in week 6, and he ran a route on 75% of Justin Fields' dropbacks. In week 5, when his usage looked better, he had a snap share of 72% while running a route on 65% of Justin Fields' dropbacks. In other words, his usage was actually a little bit better this past week. Yes, his rush share and his target share took a hit, but he was on the field more and he was running more routes. The Bears have had the 7th toughest schedule for running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed to start the season, but it's the 8th easiest from here on out. Now could be a good time to buy into David Montgomery. Add Justin Fields. And speaking of Justin Fields, he's looking a lot better. He's given us a top 12 QB1 performance in consecutive weeks. And after averaging just 15 pass attempts per game over his first 3, he's been at 23.3 over his last 3. Chicago's gone from about a 30% pass rate to a 43% pass rate during this time. That's resulted in more scrambles for Justin Fields. According to Pro Football Focus's data, Fields has 23 scrambles over his last 3 games. He had 10 during his first 3. That could explain why his rushing yards per game has jumped from 32 to 62. It's counterintuitive, but a more pass-heavy approach could allow Fields to get his legs going a little bit more. Now, the Bears have a tough schedule for quarterbacks moving forward, but in the short term, it's pretty average. Over the next month, not too bad. So if you need a streamer or you're looking for someone who at least has a shot to be a plug-and-play option, get Justin Fields. Add Robbie Anderson. So Robbie Anderson got traded to the Cardinals on Monday, and Arizona likely made that move because Marquise Brown is injured. He's going to be out for an extended period of time. Now, the Cardinals are getting DeAndre Hopkins back, but they needed someone who could stretch the field, and Anderson can at least do that. Is he going to thrive in this offense? More than likely not. Hopkins is going to command a 20+% target share. Rondell Moore has been heavily involved in that offense as a slot guy. Anderson, though, he's rostered in just 12% of Yahoo leagues. And it's worth seeing if anything develops with him there. It's not like we've never seen him be relevant in fantasy football before. Add Kenyon Drake and Gus Edwards. So J.K. Dobbins' knee evidently tightened up in their game against the Giants this past week. He missed the second half as a result. Kenyon Drake then handled the majority of Baltimore's running back rushes, and he finished with 19.7 PPR points. So if Dobbins misses time in the short term, Kenyon Drake is the guy that you want to add. But don't sleep on Gus Edwards' return either. According to John Harbaugh, Edwards is close to returning from his knee injury that he sustained last year. He's been an effective back in Baltimore. And even if he's not 100% right away, there's always a chance that his body deals with his return a little bit better than J.K. Dobbins' body is. You never know how these guys are going to react coming off an injury. So Edwards right now is an easy stash if you have an IR spot. And even if you don't, because of this Dobbins news, I think that he's still a decent add. He's just a longer term one compared to Kenyon Drake. Add Add Khalil Shakir. So this week's waivers, they're not that strong. You're going to be forced to make some speculative moves. And I think Khalil Shakir is a perfect add with that context. Isaiah McKenzie came back in week 6 after a concussion that he had in week 4. And he played ahead of Shakir as Buffalo's slot guy. McKenzie was on the field for 22 more snaps and he saw 5 targets. Shakir had 2. But McKenzie also botched a pitch from Josh Allen and he had some issues with his hands too. He did not look good against Kansas City. If anyone watched that game, you saw Isaiah McKenzie making some bad mistakes. Now, as I noted before on this show with Khalil Shakir, he was an undervalued prospect in my model. And one of his comparables was Cooper Kupp. It wasn't his only comp, but it was one of them. The slot role in Buffalo is valuable. You're talking about a starting player in the most explosive passing offense in football, or at least one of them. We could eventually see some change being made. And if that happens, Shakir would be very fantasy relevant. Buy or hold Raheem Mostert. Look, I know that you're ready for the inevitable Raheem Mostert injury, but there's no guarantee that's going to happen. And the truth is, he's crushing it right now. He saw a season-high 82% running back rush share in week 6, and he had more routes run than Chase Edmonds for a 4th consecutive week. He's seen almost 16 rush attempts per game over his last 3. And this might not stop you guys. Miami, according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method, they have the 3rd best schedule for running backs over their next 4 games, and they've got the 3rd best schedule from now through the end of the season. You might feel like trading Mostert away right now. You might be asking yourself, is this really sustainable? But I'm not sure the market is ever going to believe in Raheem Mostert. So he could be a really cheap way to get production at a tough position to get production at. Sell Jeff Wilson. So it turns out I'm much lower on Jeff Wilson versus the consensus in my rest of season rankings. Kyle Shanahan seems to believe that Elijah Mitchell is going to return after the 49ers Week 9 bye. That means that San Francisco has 2 games left before that happens. One of those games is against the Chiefs. The 49ers at least have some chance in that contest this week to hit a negative game script. That's not that great for Jeff Wilson, at least compared to other running backs. On the season, Wilson's averaging just a 5.9% target share per game. He's not used that much as a receiver. So a negative game script, not great. After Kansas City, they get the Rams. LA ranks as a top 5 matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. They've been good against running backs. So there's at least some chance that Jeff Wilson isn't all that effective in fantasy football over his next 2 games. And then they hit their bye week, and then Elijah Mitchell is back. Or he's hopefully back. So as a result, it may not be a bad idea to just cash in right now and get something for Wilson before Mitchell's back. And if any of you aren't even using Jeff Wilson, that's definitely the case. Add Greg Dulcich. Albert O was a healthy scratch for the Broncos on Monday night. Greg Dulcich finally made his NFL debut, and it was a good one. He saw 12% target share, not great, but not horrible, and he ran a route on 26 of Russell Wilson's 32 dropbacks. He also found the end zone on a big play. It's tough to find a reliable tight end, and even though he's a rookie, I think he's worth throwing a dart at this week. Add the Miami Dolphins defense. The Dolphins are going to host the Steelers this week. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, Miami's a 7-point favorite, and according to adjusted fantasy points allowed, Pittsburgh's been a middle-of-the-road opponent for opposing defenses. I think regardless of who's under center for Pittsburgh, because Kenny Pickett is dealing with a concussion, Miami's a pretty logical streaming defense. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com, join the Patreon, all that good stuff. Otherwise, thanks for listening. I will catch you tomorrow with the Weekly 10 Trend Show.